Growing Green Thumbs with Portland Nursery, where a novice and seasoned gardener come together to talk about all things plants. This week, we're very happy to be hosting Patch, our first guest of the season, who's here to talk about bonsai basics with Katie and me. But before we get into that, Katie has her weekly reminder of what zone we're broadcasting from and why that's an important point to remember.
8B, it's important to remember because that's what we can grow here.
Perfect.
That's going to be my catchphrase. It's starting to sound kind of catchphrasey.
We should put that on like a t-shirt. Zone 8B.
With like my face.
Don't forget it. Patch, welcome to the show. I know Katie and I are both really excited to have you on here with us today. I'm especially excited though because I've been trying to hook up with you for like a year or so to pick your brain about bonsai for either like a YouTube video or a reel or pretty much anything on any platform. But it's been really busy, obviously, and hectic for everyone over this last probably 2 years. So we kept missing each other until now. So I'm super excited to hear what you have to say today. And again, thanks for being on the show.
Yeah,
thank you.
And I'm stoked because I've worked with Patch for a while now. I don't even know how long it's been, but and I don't know a whole lot about bonsai. This is why we have you on, because I'm just kind of like a little bit like, I don't know, go ask Patch about the bonsai questions. But for our listeners, can you tell us a little bit more about your gardening background? Kind of like what your gardening story is, both in general and how you got interested in bonsai. No big deal.
Yeah, definitely. I, like a lot of people in the area, started out sort of following my parents around the garden and looking at what they were doing, but I never really got into gardening myself until adulthood. Mm-hmm. Working at Portland Nursery really kicked it into high gear for me. Prior to working here, I was always interested in nature and art, and spent a number of years selling leaf-related art on the road, but something about tiny trees and pots really just did it for me in an artistic sense. It was so cool and majestic and defied belief. So
absolutely. So I actually want to bring things back just for 1 second. So I think some people have this notion of what bonsai is, or most people probably do. But I also have a feeling that maybe some people tend to think of it as like a specific plant as opposed to an art form. So maybe before we go too much further into the conversation, can you talk a little bit about what bonsai is and why you love it so much?
Yeah, bonsai is the art of keeping trees alive in small trays or plants alive in small pots. But traditionally, it's done with stuff that's going to be lignified, woody trunks and branches. And for me, the appeal was really because I always wanted to live on a piece of property with a lot of acreage and trees around, but lived in an apartment in Portland and didn't have a lot of space. So it was a good way to bring trees into my life.
So are most of the bonsai that you've created indoor plants?
I have not done many indoor bonsai. The majority of what I do is outdoor.
Do you have like a patio or a balcony or something? Okay.
Yeah, I've got a small backyard. We actually moved to a place with a little bit more of a backyard for my bonsai trees. It's about 400 square feet. But because the art form's so small, I've been able to pack about 100 trees into that area.
I was just going to ask how many you have.
Yeah.
It's 100?
100 plantings. Most of them range from 1 to 10 trees per planting.
Oh, okay. Right on.
I have a question. So you use the term lignified. What does that mean for our audience?
Yeah, that's just mostly speaking to the difference between the structure of the plant. Some plants are going to be softer and more fleshy along the stem and the stalk, and some are going to become wood as they age, and that's the lignification process. So for bonsai, you want something that has a woody trunk, and ideally it will lend itself to woody branches as well.
Okay. So if we're going to kind of frame this conversation, and shape it and gear it towards somebody who's obviously like a new to creating bonsai, what's the first thing, if you decide that you want to partake in this, what's the first thing you should go out and do?
The first thing I would recommend for someone just getting into bonsai is to look at what is successfully growing outside around where they live.
Okay.
So deciduous trees, conifers, those are going to be the most common types that people work with. In the Pacific Northwest, we're very lucky. We have one of the best climates for growing a wide range of trees outside.
Yeah, we were just talking about that in the last episode of just like, how much diversity we have for like growing things, especially
year round.
Yeah. Can you do evergreen and deciduous bonsai trees?
You can, yeah. Traditional bonsai kind of is more just a deciduous and coniferous material, but lately in the world, people are exploring material more and more, and it's getting pretty exciting what they're working with. I'm seeing shrubby materials and small bushes even getting turned into what looks like a cool tree in a pot.
And if you wanted to begin this journey, obviously there's certain tools that you would need, right?
Yeah, there are some tools that are specific to bonsai. For most entry-level people, you can get away with basic garden shears and small pruning scissors for quite a long time before you need some of the more...
Like the kits.
The kits, yeah. There's some that's going to lend itself to higher quality cuts and just different scenarios within the art that you're going to need certain tools for. But most entry-level trees and practitioners, I personally used just some normal shears and some scissors for about 3 years before investing in high quality tools.
So if you had to go out and recommend some plants that are maybe a little kinder to the novice, could you make a recommendation there?
Yeah, I would definitely lean towards junipers. Juniperus nana. It's small, easy to bend, easy to work with, easy to prune, and they keep their foliage all year, which is really appealing for the artistic side of it. You can have that nice greenery to look at. If you like the deciduous trees, Japanese maples really are awesome for bonsai.
Cool. Are you looking for things like certain characteristics, like when you're at the nursery and like you're specifically selecting one out of, a tray of multiples? Like,
yeah, what are you looking for there?
Yeah, personally, I'm looking for anything that's quirky. You start at the root base. You're looking for really a wide root base where the tree meets the soil line. That kind of symbolizes strength and stability in the tree. And then you kind of follow that line from the bottom of the root all the way up to the top of the tree, looking for it to taper, getting narrower as it goes up. And then any kind of cool bends or kinks or odd branches along the way definitely can add interest to the final product.
Okay.
And would that also kind of, because bonsai can take time, right?
Yeah, so that's the name of the game, is time.
So if you start off with something that already has a bit of shape to it, not that you're cutting corners or anything, but it might lend itself to that ultimate design a little bit more than if you have to start trading it from zero, right?
Definitely. And some species will work quicker than others if you're looking for getting it to like a show quality tree. So conifers, you can build a tree, and by build a tree, I mean take a piece of nursery stock, train the foliage, train the roots, shape it up just in a matter of years, maybe 5 years, to make it into something pretty impressive, whereas a deciduous tree might take double the time.
Okay.
Do you ever, I feel like I've gotten this question a lot, but for our listeners, bonsai, do you consider it like when it's only in the container, or like is it like topiary if you're planting it in the ground? Is there like a difference there?
Yeah, there is a lot of difference there, actually. Bonsai is in the container specifically.
Okay.
By definition, almost, right?
By definition, yeah. The translation of bonsai is a 2-part word that breaks down to tray planting. So by definition, it does have to be something in a container. But when you limit the root space, there are a lot of variables involved in trying to get the finest roots possible, as opposed to in ground where you can kind of let the plant do what it wants with its roots.
Got it.
Going back to something you mentioned just a couple of minutes ago, you were saying, to kind of go out, especially if you're growing outdoor, I would imagine, you kind of go around your neighbors, see what's growing well in your area. Do you think there's also an element, let's say if you're growing indoor or even outdoor, kind of like picking a plant that fits your lifestyle? Something that's maybe a little easier to care for in terms of watering needs and things like that, if you're like kind of out of the house all the time.
Yeah, I can't speak much to indoor bonsai because I have very little experience there. But in terms of outdoor, there are some that you can work with more than others. If you get a Chinese elm, you'll be pruning it 3 or 4 times a season because of how vigorous it is. Whereas if you get a Japanese maple, you may only be pruning it once or twice a season because it's a little bit slower growing. And then pine, you may only approach it once a year.
Okay.
Do you find with the watering, though, because they are, a lot of bonsais, if they're a smaller one, they're in a sort of narrower pot or container, rather. And do you find that they need more frequent waterings regardless of the type of plant?
I do, yeah, just because the soil space is so small, there's not a lot of moisture retention in general, so it is quick for things to dry up. I personally plant my trees in a very high drainage mix, which I end up watering almost daily, although in the Northwest, when it's raining, I can get away with not doing it.
Okay.
One of the things I was reading in preparation for this interview, some of the articles I came across noted that you really don't want a ton of like heavy soil or like a lot of organic matter in there. To me, from what I was reading, it almost sounded more like an orchid mix or something like that you're planting in.
Yeah, inorganics are ideal. Personally, I think pumice is the best friend for the bonsai grower. Pumice has really sharp edges. It's a volcanic stone, so when a root rubs along a piece of that pumice, it creates a little tear in that root where it's stimulated to send out new growth, which will create finer and finer branching in the root system, and you can avoid those thick circling roots, so you can get away with potting less frequently.
I did have one more question about potting, if that's okay. So
I don't mind.
Look at Katie. I feel like I'm dominating the questions. I want to know.
You're way more interested in bonsai than me, so that makes sense.
So when you're first planting, I also read some articles that suggest that you want to like cover the drainage hole with some sort of netting, but I could not really understand what the purpose of that would be, or if it's even actually necessary.
Yeah, that is very necessary in
what does that do?
Most bonsai pots. It's going to prevent your soil from falling out. The majority of bonsai pots are going to have pretty large drainage holes, and the soil we're using usually is about a quarter of an inch particle size is pretty common.
So once you pick a plant, you maybe have some basic tools. You've picked out, you have your soil and your pot and everything's ready to go. You plant the whatever it is you're working with. How do you actually start to create?
This is a very hard question because now we're leaning into the art side of it. There's some horticultural practice that's very important, and I recommend every beginner, at least for the first year or so, just focus on keeping your plants alive.
Okay.
I definitely spent the first year just watering, practicing fertilizer schedules, and not even touching roots or styling until I kind of had a better grasp of how to keep the plant alive, because that's the most important part of the practice. Once you're feeling confident that you can keep a plant alive for a while, there's a few different ways to approach it depending on the species you're working with. Conifers and pines and junipers and things like that. Usually you can only work on one end of the tree in a season, meaning you can work on the top, the foliage mass, or you can work on the roots and getting it into a smaller pot. Whereas a deciduous tree, you can do a pretty hard prune on the top and a pretty hard prune on the roots and get it into a small pot all in one go, because they're pretty resilient.
Okay. Is there like a time of year for any of this? Like if somebody got, say, a bonsai as a like Christmas present or something like that, should they be, putting it in the pot and like going for it, or should they hold off for the right season?
Yeah, I try to avoid a timeline for bonsai and a calendar because a lot of it is specific to the plant you're working with, but a pretty safe bet is to go with the spring season. Mm-hmm. Most plants are moving the majority of their nutrition when they start to grow, and that's when it can heal wounds and it can get pruned back without causing major amounts of stress.
Okay, so new gardeners who might have gotten it as a gift or something, keep your shears in the drawer and don't play with it until spring.
Wait until springtime. Right when buds start to swell is when I like to look at it as the perfect window. You see the buds swelling, there's a lot of nutrition moving in the tree. So that's a good time to style the top or to do a repot, or both in the case of a deciduous tree.
Okay.
Can you talk a little bit about some kind of basic bonsai techniques that a beginner might need to know?
Yeah, some basic techniques for beginners are going to be repotting. Primarily, you want to be pruning out the thickest roots because those are going to be for anchoring the plant. And in such a tiny pot and on a small scale, you don't really need anchoring because you're actually going to be wiring the tree into the pot for its stability. So you want to rely on the fine roots that really pull in the majority of the nutrition. So root pruning is one big technique that's used in bonsai to maintain that small pot and keep it healthy in the long term.
Is that where like the root rake comes into effect?
Yeah, that's where the root rake comes into effect. That's a great tool. I'm actually a little scared to use a root rake because most of them are metal and they can cause damage to the roots if you're too aggressive. And
So are you like teasing out the root kind of and then trimming them and reburying them? Or how does that even, I'm having a hard time even conceptualizing of it. I know we're limited because we're doing a podcast as opposed to having some video to show some things, but I'm actually having a hard time wrapping my head around that.
And it's okay if you say, like, look up some YouTube videos. Like,
yeah,
that's fine.
I definitely, if you're interested in getting into bonsai, I definitely recommend getting into some YouTube spirals and checking it out because there's a lot of information out there in terms of all sides of bonsai. But if I were to paint the picture, it would look something like taking a nursery plant and waiting until that moment in spring where you see those buds swell. And then you can take it out of its black plastic pot and dig away at the soil, separate the roots, and depending on the species, you can reduce a certain percentage of those roots. It's pretty safe to say most plants can have about a 30% reduction in their roots.
Okay.
Deciduous trees, you can get away with more. I've taken off about 60 or 70% of a root mass.
And this is when you would remove some of those anchoring roots?
Yeah, you try to remove the thickest roots, and you want to leave as many small feeder roots as possible because those are really what's going to take in the nutrition.
I can actually understand that much better now. I appreciate that.
Yeah, it's a lot of nuance. Like any side of horticulture, there's a lot of nuance, and there's a lot of differing information out there. So you really want to take time to study what you're going to be doing before doing it, because in bonsai, because it's such a small scale, there can be big consequences to poor timing.
So you want to consider everything before you actually make that cut.
Definitely, yeah. Slow and steady wins the race with this one.
Okay. And then in terms of actually pruning, branches off of it, or pruning anything on there, when you're looking at the plant, how do you come up with a design, and how do you I know you just don't snip. I mean, you bend, you wire. Like, how does that all come into play?
Yeah, that's where it gets really fun with the art side of what you're doing when you're approaching the plant. There are some practitioners who will look at a tree and then draw that tree and then maybe draw an idea of what they hope for over the next 10 years. Personally, I try to avoid implementing my own eye into it too much, and just practice good quality horticultural techniques, good clean pruning, avoid crossing branches, and try to have a healthy tree. And usually the character of the plant will kind of
show itself
with time. A little bend you will notice is kind of cool, and maybe you'll realize that you want to exaggerate it down the road.
That's neat. Like, let the plant show you.
Yeah, you let the plant show you. And something I like to let new customers know too is it's never really actually done. Everyone talks about finishing their bonsai tree, but if you're doing the art form correctly, the tree's going to outlive you. So you're never really going to be done. You want to constantly be giving it the best attention for what's going to be healthy for the tree down the road.
Makes sense.
So that was another question I had. In terms of like up potting, let's say, maybe I don't know if it would be every few years. I guess it would be dependent on the plant itself. Is there like a outer limit of when, like, the tree that you've been practicing bonsai on just seems to not usually like last past that, or is it kind of indefinite?
It can be. My understanding is it can be more or less indefinite. I mean, we have some trees that have been passed on for 5 or 6 generations within families that are hundreds of years old, all just taken care of with high quality and attention to detail. And some trees get repotted every 5 years. Some trees get repotted every 2 years. Varies from species to species.
Are you feeding the plants at all? Do you remember if we touched it? Okay.
Yeah. You do want to fertilize the plants because it's in such a small soil container and mostly in aggregate soil. There's really not a natural nutrition in the aggregate. The pumice I use is just a lava. So it's
got nothing.
It's got nothing. Yeah, I use an organic, kind of an all-purpose, slow breakdown fertilizer. I don't like to push my trees too hard on the fertilizer side, but some people really do. They'll fertilize all spring, all fall.
So just like in any horticultural thing, there's like a bunch of different ways to go about it.
Yeah, that's the hard thing about bonsai is there's a lot of answers out there. You can find different ways to do it. If you want to invest a ton of energy into it and make world-class trees, there's people you can follow. If you want to just do it as a hobby and prune it and set it and forget it once in a while, you can do that. And some great resources online I'd recommend are Heron's Bonsai. It's kind of a nice, slow pace, casual Bonsai Mirai with Ryan Neal. If you want to really hit it hard with the college level, here's why, here's how, you really can find everything you want.
Cool.
We're doing something a little different with our guests on the show this season. We're sending out some questionnaires prior to people coming on the show so we can kind of get a sense of what they'd like to talk about, or, just kind of
mine them for information ahead of time.
Yeah, kind of just we'll get to know where the conversation can go, And I'm curious about something that you wrote in there, if you're okay talking about it. You had mentioned that gardening and bonsai specifically, in addition to providing you many different things, kind of helps you feel a connection to lost loved ones. Can you talk about that at all?
Yeah, because I grew up following family around the garden and spending a lot of time out in nature with family, sitting down with a piece of something that's alive and growing and getting some time to just pause and be still has lent itself to a lot of reflection, and for me personally actually worked me through a lot of the mourning process with the passing of my father, which is pretty cool and something I think as a society we don't touch on enough in general, which is pretty powerful for an art form or even horticulture in general. A lot of people after work like to go out into their garden, but if you live in an apartment, that's not always an option. And if you have a tiny balcony and one little tree, you can still go sit by that tree and
spend that time.
Yeah, and the cool thing with bonsai is because it's so tiny, when you feel small, you fit with the art.
Yeah, I could see that.
That makes sense.
Yeah, that's beautiful, Pat.
I don't know. Sorry, I was pretty nervous coming on to this podcast.
I think you're doing an awesome job.
I really appreciate the prompts and the questions, because bonsai is one of those things that I can just kind of reel on.
Yeah,
no, it's
that's
great.
Perfect.
That's what we want.
Yeah.
Well done.
You're the experienced gardener here. So let's see here. I think I had a couple, maybe a few more questions. Let's see here. How are we doing on time? We're looking all right?
Yeah, I think we're doing
okay,
great.
We're doing okay. So I know it might be like plant dependent, right? But are there any sort of common pests or diseases you can expect to have to deal with while creating bonsai, or is it all just plant dependent?
The most common thing that I notice people dealing with tends to be fungal issues, and that can be from overwatering or too wet of a soil. And that's one of the reasons I like the pumice, because it's so free draining. I haven't had to deal with any fungal issues really, but that's one of the biggest that I see people dealing with is fungal related stuff, root related issues.
If you're growing something out in a pot, because these pots are small, or most of them are kind of on the smaller side, so we don't have terrible winters here, but are you bringing those plants a little bit closer to the house in the wintertime on like deep freezes?
Yeah, depending on the quality of the tree, basically. If I've got a tree that's really early in its development and I know that I just really like the trunk and the branches are not that great yet and there's not a lot of fine branching, I don't have to worry about it freezing too much. Sorry, I feel like this is the completely wrong answer to this question.
I mean, that's okay. Everybody's got like their own sort of like, way that they do things, and there is,
is that always a right answer? Katie's a big fan of saying that,
Yeah, I'm pretty brutal with my trees, honestly. I leave stuff out to freeze. If it's zone hardy, like in the Pacific Northwest, I leave all my stuff, even stuff that's pretty close to refinement, out. This year with the freezing that we had was the first year I put frost blanket over my trees, which I do recommend you do. Because you can occasionally lose fine tips and branches, and if you've been investing 5 years into a branch, you really don't want to lose it to a freeze. Good practice, if you can't bring stuff into a greenhouse or into a cold garage, is always just to huddle your trees onto the ground or on the ground near the house. That's a good option, but the frost blanket definitely helped. But I think trees in general are far tougher than we want to give them credit for. They've been around a long time.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons that I've always been hesitant to create any bonsai is when I see ones that people are working on. My initial impulse is that this is a very delicate plant. This is a delicate situation.
It's an illusion.
But like you just said, like these plants have been.
So I don't want to give too much of a false impression because some things are delicate. Some trees have really firm branching where it won't bend; it'll just snap. Some trees will bend very well. A juniper is super. Most juniper, aside from rigid juniper, which is very rigid, most of them are very flexible.
Yeah. So again, it's like plant dependent.
Plant dependent, yeah. But once you start talking about more shrubby material and alternative stuff that hasn't really been explored much, it's kind of unknown still.
So it's like I like to say, all an experiment.
It is, yeah. It's constantly evolving, especially in North America. People have been exploring some weird species because it seems like there's not a ton of cultural gridlock. Like in Japan, I know there's a lot of reverence for the traditional art form and sticking to common practices. And in North America, it seems almost like there's been a little bit of liberation in the sense that there's some folks who just don't really care about rules, which can be fun when it comes to art. All due respect to the art form in general, I think it should be completely free. Personally, I like to see all types of species, all types of shapes. But there is a lot of back and forth in the bonsai world, and some people who would consider some stuff bonsai and some stuff not bonsai, depending on whether you're looking at it with a traditional eye or more of an open interpretation.
Sounds like a lot.
It's a lot.
Yeah.
I did have a question kind of along those lines, not so much about the plant itself, but I was curious where you fall with like the placement of figurines around the bonsai. I know some people are totally against their use and some people are fine using them. Do you use figurines?
In my own garden, I don't use mini figurines. Occasionally, I'll find a little toy dinosaur and stick it with a plant because it's kind of cute. But traditionally, the idea is that when you're adding a figurine into a pot, it's distracting from the tree.
Yeah.
And it's often used to mask or hide a lower quality tree and make it a more attractive composition.
Okay.
But it's supposed to be fun, in my opinion. It's an art form. You can put a figurine in there if it's your garden. Most shows will not allow a tree with a figurine because it becomes more of a fairy garden. Or prior to bonsai in China, the practice of penjing, which was much more landscape oriented.
That predates the practice in Japan, right?
It predates the practice in Japan, yeah. So in China, they were doing penjing, which is kind of a landscape design.
Okay, I have to just interject for 1 second here. I apologize. I know we're getting really close on our time today, and I could keep talking to you about this all day long. Is there anything else you think is really important to touch base upon real quick before we close things out today?
Definitely. Like any side of horticultural, its practices, bonsai is full of nuance, but it's not something to be intimidated by. It's a lot of fun. It can be super meditative. Start with a pace you're comfortable with. One tree is enough. You don't have to jump in like
you don't need 100.
You don't need 100.
Maybe you will,
Maybe
but
one
not
day.
right now.
It's a lot of fun, and it's definitely worth doing.
That's amazing. Thank you again for being on the show today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Pat.
Yeah,
It's been
thanks for
really.
having me.
I learned a lot, actually.
Thank you so much. It's been a lot of fun.
Okay, many thanks again to TalkCast PDX for producing Growing Green Thumbs with Portland Nursery, and thank you all for listening as well. We'll be back next week with our very first remote interview with Leah McDaniel from Black Sheep Gardens. And she's all the way on the East Coast in upstate New York. She does some amazing floral designs in the form of bouquets and centerpieces and like straight up installation pieces for weddings and other events. I don't think she does funerals though.
But I've seen the pictures you showed me, and it's really cool stuff.
Yeah, if you want to get a head start, I would, you can go onto Instagram and just check out Black Sheep Gardens. You have a sense of kind of where we're going with the interview. Please remember, while Katie is here answering all of my plant questions, Portland Nursery is always available to answer all of your plant questions. Visit us today here in Portland, Oregon at 50th and Stark, 90th and Division, or check out portlandnursery.com, and we'll talk to you next week.
See you next week.
See ya. Thanks, Patch.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Life is just one long hangover. So great that you can't